2014. The black flag of ISIS rose across the Middle East. It brought a level of violence the modern world had never witnessed. But the terror didn't stop at the front line. Behind the scenes, even the wives of high-ranking ISIS leaders became targets. Some were turned into informants, others were executed by the very men they once served. How did a local cell become a global threat? The answer lies in the ruins of a collapsed state. It started long before the world knew the name ISIS. March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. Within weeks, the entire Iraqi government structure vanished. The order came down to dissolve the National Army. Hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers were sent home with their weapons, but no paychecks. Police forces abandoned their posts. The border guards walked away from the desert crossings. The footage from that time shows a country in free fall. Looters stripped government buildings to the concrete. There were no courts, no laws, and no protection for civilians. Millions of Iraqis lost their livelihoods in a single day. Violence became the new currency. In the cities of Baghdad, Fallujah, and Ramadi, the sounds of daily life were replaced by the roar of car bombs. Kidnappings for ransom became a business model. Revenge killings turned neighborhoods into morgues. At first glance, a chaotic civil war, but in reality, a recruitment opportunity. Armed groups moved into the vacuum. They offered a simple deal: protection in exchange for absolute loyalty. By 2004, one man rose above the other warlords. His name was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He built a network that became known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The camera records the aftermath of his work: charred shells of buses and blood-stained marketplaces. Zarqawi's methods were so brutal, they shocked even the central leadership of Al-Qaeda. He didn't just target soldiers, he targeted everyone. June 7, 2006. A U.S. airstrike finally killed Zarqawi in a safe house near Baquba. The world expected his movement to die with him, but this was only the beginning. The group did not vanish, it evolved. In October 2006, the organization rebranded. It took a new title: the Islamic State of Iraq. The name was a signal. They no longer wanted to operate as a hidden cell. They wanted territory. They wanted a country. The goal had shifted from insurgency to statehood. There was no turning back. Control was the primary objective. From the first day of operations, the organization demanded total submission. High-ranking fighters lived under constant surveillance. Loyalty was not assumed. It was tested through repeated trials. The leadership intentionally integrated families into this web of oversight. How did they ensure no one spoke? The answer was simple: fear. Women married to fighters lost their individual status. They became physical extensions of their husbands. Every word and every gesture carried a price. If a fighter failed, his wife suffered. If a wife spoke out of turn, her children faced the consequences. A single mistake triggered a chain reaction of punishment. This rigid structure reached its peak in April 2010. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi assumed command after his predecessors were killed in tactical strikes. At that moment, the group was fractured. Raids had decimated their ranks. Arrests had emptied their safe houses. Baghdadi chose a different path. He operated in the shadows. He rebuilt the network in silence. He ignored external threats and focused on internal purity. He believed a traitor was more dangerous than a drone. Punishment became a daily routine. Trust vanished completely. Every member was a suspect. Even the smallest lapse in discipline resulted in execution or imprisonment. As Baghdadi tightened his grip, the terror crossed the threshold of the home. The footage from the era shows empty streets and shuttered windows. The wives of commanders were the most monitored. They lived in proximity to the group's darkest secrets. They knew the locations of the money. They saw the faces of the couriers. They heard the whispered plans for the next strike. They were never left alone. Guards stood outside their doors. The organization moved families between safe houses without warning. They seized mobile phones. They intercepted every letter and every digital message. The leadership recruited neighbors to act as informants. A single report of a strange visitor or a whispered conversation was enough to trigger an interrogation. Women were ordered to remain silent and unobservant. Asking a question was a crime. Showing doubt was a death sentence. In many cases, the group interrogated wives simply because their husbands were under suspicion. If a fighter fled the battlefield, his family paid the debt in blood. By 2012, the system was absolute. The group had transformed into a prison with no walls. Events accelerated. Syria provided Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with a new strategic opening. The civil war across the border created a power vacuum. His fighters moved through the desert without meeting resistance. Entire families followed the convoys. Women were promised religious fulfillment and a secure future. The reality was different. Armed guards met the newcomers at the border. Movement was restricted. Rules were enforced with violence. Leaving the territory became a crime punishable by death. Houses were converted into monitored living quarters. Informants moved into every neighborhood. Suspicion replaced community. There was no privacy behind closed doors. The sound of heavy locks became constant. What was sold as a sanctuary became a prison. By the time the women realized the danger, the exits were sealed. June 2014. The situation escalated in a single night. ISIS militants launched a massive assault on Mosul. This was Iraq's second-largest city. The Iraqi army disintegrated in hours. Soldiers abandoned their posts and fled. They left behind thousands of vehicles and heavy weapons. The militants seized the central banks. They took hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi arrived in Mosul days later. He walked into the great mosque of al-Nuri. He announced the birth of a caliphate. This was no longer a hidden cell of insurgents. It was now a self-proclaimed state. Millions of civilians were suddenly living under its laws. The territory stretched from northern Iraq deep into eastern Syria. The city of Raqqa became the administrative capital. Holding territory changed the group's psychology. Success fueled paranoia. The leaders transitioned from hiding in caves to sitting in offices. They established courts, tax systems, and prisons. They had more to lose. Every person with internal knowledge was now a potential informant. This included the wives of high-ranking commanders. The leadership stopped viewing these women as family. They became intelligence assets. ISIS commanders believed secrets leaked through the home. A wife might speak to a neighbor. A child might repeat an overheard conversation. Normal family life ended. The organization prioritizes security over blood ties. The Amnayat was expanded to enforce this order. This was the internal security branch. They functioned as secret police. Their agents wore masks and carried silenced pistols. They monitored their own fighters. They interrogated families. They searched for any sign of hesitation or disloyalty. By late 2014, the accusations turned inward. The atmosphere became toxic. If a leader was arrested or killed in an airstrike, his family did not receive sympathy. They received a knock on the door from the secret police. Zero sympathy existed. Only suspicion remained. During this period, security forces detained multiple women married to mid-level and senior ISIS figures. The arrests took place in cities like Al-Qaim and Deir ez-Zor. The charges were specific. Some women possessed secret mobile phones. Others contacted relatives living outside the caliphate. This was a capital offense. Several women were caught planning escapes with their children. In the ISIS system, intention was the same as a confession. There was no legal process and no defense. Decisions were reached in minutes. The results were final. Some women were locked in makeshift basement prisons. Others were forced into black SUVs and driven away. They were never seen again. Executions of women accused of betrayal began during these months, but the group kept these killings hidden. There were no public squares, no shouting crowds, no official announcements on loudspeakers. The killings happened indoors in windowless rooms. The militants buried the bodies in unmarked trenches without records. How did the group track its own purges? They used cameras. Between the end of 2014 and the start of 2015, a new pattern emerged. Members began filming punishments that were never intended for the public eye. These were not the high-definition videos released to the internet. These recordings were for internal eyes only. The footage shows a different reality. The videos are short. The image quality is poor. Militants used basic mobile phones in cramped rooms or abandoned construction sites. There is no cinematic editing. There is no dramatic music. The silence is the only soundtrack. These clips were not propaganda. They were digital receipts. They served as physical proof that an order had been carried out. Years later, the regime collapsed. Iraqi intelligence units and investigative journalists entered the abandoned ruins. They searched safe houses and tunnels. They recovered discarded phones, scorched hard drives, and hidden memory cards. Many devices contained video files that had never been uploaded to the web. Experts analyzed the metadata. The timestamps and location tags confirmed the timeline, late 2014 to early 2015. The clips show women being punished or executed for spying. The camera often stays behind the victim. Faces are covered with black cloth. Names are never spoken aloud. The footage is cold and functional. It was meant to be deleted after viewing, but the files remained on the chips. They became a digital archive of the purge. Events accelerated. The group was no longer just killing enemies. It was consuming itself from within. There was no turning back. January 2015. This was the turning point. The erasure of these women was a calculated move. ISIS command did not want names or faces to remain. They wanted them deleted from history. Forensic investigators later traced the identities of the victims. Several were wives of senior ISIS commanders. These men had either defected, fallen into enemy hands, or were suspected of leaking secrets. In the logic of the caliphate, a wife was a strategic liability. Loyalty did not matter. Execution was the only way to eliminate the risk. Evidence surfaced slowly. Years later, video clips began to leak onto the dark web. Mass confusion followed. Propaganda accounts flooded the internet with fake footage and false labels. Some videos were recycled from older wars. Others were digitally altered. This disinformation campaign allowed the group to dismiss the killings as rumors. But digital specialists analyzed the metadata. They confirmed that a specific set of recordings was authentic. The architecture and the sun's angle matched known ISIS execution sites. These verified clips proved a dark reality. ISIS was purging its own ranks from the inside. This internal slaughter began long before the group started to lose territory. By early 2015, the momentum shifted. The battle for the Syrian town of Kobani ended. ISIS retreated in total failure. The world watched the defeat on live television. The shockwaves hit Raqqa immediately. The pressure intensified from above. United States airstrikes and Allied bombings increased across Iraq and Syria. The footage shows the results. Weapons depots turned into fireballs. High-ranking leaders were eliminated in their moving vehicles. Communication became a death sentence. Electronic signals were tracked and targeted. Trust within the high command vanished. Doubt spread through the barracks. Foreign fighters from Europe and North Africa began to realize the situation. The promised victory was a lie. Some fighters requested transfers to quiet sectors. Others began looking for smugglers. They were secretly planning their escape. The sound of jet engines was constant. The caliphate was shrinking. It was the beginning of the end. January 2015. ISIS leadership faced a new threat from within. Senior commanders were terrified. They believed every defector was a walking map of their supply routes and bank accounts. One man leaving could expose 100 hiding places. The response was immediate and violent. The group stopped looking at the front lines and turned its weapons inward. Suspicion became the new law. No commander was safe. Security units watched every secret meeting. Informants reported every private conversation. Entire families were dragged into interrogation rooms. ISIS intelligence focused on one specific group, the wives of foreign fighters. The reasoning was simple. These women were dangerous. They spoke 3 or 4 languages. They had brothers and cousins in Europe and the Gulf. Unlike the local recruits, these women remembered life before the caliphate. They remembered supermarkets, schools, and freedom. This memory made them a liability. In early 2015, the purge reached Raqqa. Security forces detained several wives of foreign commanders. The charges were vague. Some husbands were accused of planning an escape. Others were accused of losing their religious faith. The arrests happened fast. At first glance, a routine check, but in reality, a death sentence. The footage from similar raids shows the pattern. Masked men kicked in doors at 3 in the morning. They dragged women out in front of their screaming children. There were no warrants. There was no need for evidence. In the Islamic State, an accusation was a conviction. The group held internal trials. But these were not courts. There were no lawyers in the room. There was no defense allowed. Security officials sat behind desks and signed papers. The proceedings lasted minutes. Once the official reached a verdict, the process ended. There were no appeals, there was only the executioner. Events accelerated. Defectors later provided the details. They confirmed that during this period, the group executed at least 3 women in secret. Their crime was knowing too much. They knew their husbands wanted to leave. They knew the routes out of the desert. The sound of a heavy iron door closing. That was the final sound they heard. ISIS did not record their names. No graves were marked. The group erased them from history. The purge was a message to every fighter in the ranks. Loyalty was not enough. Silence was the only way to survive. Thus ended the first wave of internal executions. Zero information reached the families. ISIS officials blocked every message. They did not want stories that could create sympathy or doubt among the ranks. The group controlled the narrative with total silence. 2015. Airstrikes intensified across the region. High-ranking ISIS figures died in Syria and Iraq every week. These deaths created a logistics crisis for the leadership. Thousands of widows remained in the caliphate. ISIS commanders viewed these women as unfinished business. They were liabilities. These women knew names, locations, and secret protocols. A new rule took shape in the shadows. Widows were forbidden from returning to their home countries. They could not move toward the borders. They could not leave ISIS territory under any circumstances. In many cases, officials delivered a direct message. The women would be reassigned. They were to marry another fighter or commander immediately. This was not a choice. It was a military order. For many women, the realization hit hard. There was no future. Their husbands were dead, but the punishment continued. In the footage from this period, the streets are gray and silent. No one mourns openly. Why did they force these marriages? At first glance, it was about support. But in reality, it was about surveillance. A single woman was a security risk. A married woman was under control. Refusing a new husband was treated as open defiance. In the ISIS legal system, obedience was demanded even after loss. Grief was not permitted. Independence was seen as a direct threat to the state. Events accelerated in the summer of 2015. One specific case shocked the local fighters. A widow known only as a kunya refused to marry a second time. Her husband had been a senior commander in Syria. He was dead. She stayed in her home. She did not try to escape. But this was only the beginning. The camera records the aftermath of such refusals. Heavy doors. Armed guards in the hallways. Acuna sat in a room with no windows. She waited for the verdict. The court delivered its decision quickly.